You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 350 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering Chelsea Manning, the tensions between the U.S. and Iran, and then potentially moving forward on a peace agreement in Yemen. All right, everybody, I really need you to take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where this show and my daily news roundup can be found in the right-hand column on the homepage. If you listen to the show and like the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. I do update current events on the show, so it made sense to listen to every episode. And then if you want, you could donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So I'm starting off on today's show with a story that I was very surprised to find in the New York Times. It's an editorial, but it's about how in neighborhoods of Baltimore, the police have become the bad guys with the guns. Now, I think, probably for most Americans and for polite, kind of centrist political thought, this is somewhat out of bounds, but I thought this article did a great job of making this case without resorting to just kind of the white versus black. This is just, racists running around beating up on black people because they can. So I guess first off, it's worth, kind of remembering here that a bad guy with a gun is a guy who uses the gun to harm you unfairly. So if you're trying to rob somebody and they use a gun against you, that doesn't make them a bad guy with the gun. But if somebody uses a gun to rob you, then they're the bad guy with the gun. And so this article just goes through different cases where there's corruption in Baltimore policing. That means that, the cops are stealing drugs from people and then selling them on their own. Oftentimes, searches for drugs or guns are done unconstitutionally, so they're violating people's rights all the time. In search of, I'm sure, drugs a lot of times, or cash on these dealers to steal and then sell on their own or, keep the money. The article does a good job of not just pointing to the, the specific cases, but also going into, I think, more institutionally why it happens. I don't think every cop's a racist and a terrible person, although, even the most adamant cop supporters will often admit that there's bad apples in there. And, I'm certainly probably think there's a little bit more than, the thin blue line people say, but there's an institutional thing where, as a cop, what you want to do, I think, is to probably move up and become detectives and stuff like that. And then, they do these really special new projects that are supposed to, help clean up bad neighborhoods and, invite people to be a part of them. What they do is then they put them in these undercover cars and they tell them to drive around the streets and, try to preempt violence by taking guns off the streets. And so, people buy into this and they think, probably that they're doing a good thing. However, what it amounts to is, people, these cops driving around in undercover cars and in plain clothes, jumping out at people, tackling them to the ground, performing unconstitutional searches, then making them justify themselves for what they're doing. Even if they don't have a gun on, where are you going, what you doing, and not answering those questions, probably could get you arrested in a lot of these cases. Maybe not sentenced to anything, but they take you down and, book you in and stuff like that. And, there's plenty of evidence. I think I've talked about this on the past in the show. I mean, Baltimore is kind of notorious for being, I think, criminalized law enforcement, where you had this one particular squad that had, one of these special purposes. I forget whether it's drugs or guns or whatever, but, they were found to carry fake guns. And, they would, plant BB guns on people. That way, if they shot them or ran them down, then they could, throw the gun there and say, oh, I had no choice. I thought he was going to shoot me. Also have evidence of Baltimore police officers planting drugs. In fact, I think there's been a few cases, which means there's an awful lot of now cases like to be reviewed, because any case these officers work on are now suspect. If they're planting drugs at one crime scene, why not plant them at others? And then I think the article also does a good job of contrasting what cops often end up doing in more upper class neighborhoods, which is, somebody calls the police because there's an emergency or because, something wrong is happening in the neighborhood. and the police either come and rescue people or come and, resolve maybe a dispute, car crash kind of thing. Or, maybe somebody saw somebody suspicious around the neighborhood, and then the cops, drive around. They, maybe kind of politely talk to a couple people, ask if they've seen anything, show a presence, and then leave, oftentimes without tackling people to the ground who are walking their dog or pulling people over driving their kids to school. The reason I brought this article up is because I thought it does a very good job of questioning kind of the moral authority of the state and just simply believing that armed branches of the American government do justice with their guns and their weapons. And so to look at this on a larger scale, in the same way, I think you compare it to American foreign policy. I think in most cases, you don't have, U.S. troops that want to kill and terrorize the Iraqi people or anything like that. But an awful lot of that ended up happening. And so I think when you look at it that way, easy to understand why the Iraqis, living in Fallujah or impoverished people in the worst neighborhoods of Baltimore feel terrorized by the armed people of the U.S. government and don't look at them as the good guys. Of course, the immediate reaction to this always is, well, does that mean ISIS or the gang members or Saddam is the good guy with the guns? And, that's obviously not the case either. A good example of, the police and the state being the bad guys with the guns is the case of Chelsea Manning, where she's headed back to jail now. Things saying, I'd rather starve to death than testify in the court. So, this is, quite the statement, and she continues to take this very important moral stand, standing up for constitutional rights and the rest of us and standing against the persecution of journalists and everything like that. But at the same time, really concerned and hope that something is done here to work out a solution that Chelsea Manning doesn't have to spend, months behind bars again. Just for a quick recap on the story as to why Chelsea is in jail, she was subpoenaed in early March by the Eastern District of Virginia federal court grand jury and was required to testify about her decision to make leaks and the case of, her leaking all the Iraq, Afghan, State Department, Guantanamo files to WikiLeaks. Now, this would require her to do so in a secret grand jury where she does not have legal representation and, would be on the record, although she's been offered immunity for her testimony. Chelsea says, I don't want to testify here. In fact, that you did a very extensive investigation back in 2012. I've, done my time for that crime, been granted clemency by Obama. And so if you want information, go look at the court records. But if not, I'm done talking about it. Well, this isn't an option. She's held in contempt of court, thrown in jail for 2 months. I think spent close to the first month, if not, maybe a little less than that, in solitary confinement, only allowed out of her cell for 2 hours a day. Right, I don't know, maybe a week ago or so, second week of May here, Chelsea Manning is released from jail as that, I guess, grand jury and therefore subpoena expired. However, a new grand jury must have been impaneled or a different one, and she was re-subpoenaed and again refused to testify and has now been ordered back to jail. All right, I have some stories on Africa. I just want to continue to run through these at least once a week because I think there's important things developing here, and rather than waiting for something big to happen and never having covered, what's going on in Algeria on the show at all, but to have talked about the protest movement in that country in the past. All right, so we'll start with Sudan. Protests there ongoing. Of course, the 30-year president of the country, dictator Bashar, stepped down, leaving a power vacuum that was filled by a ruling military council. The initial leader of that stepped down after the protests didn't stop. Protests continued, and then the ruling military council agreed to talks with protest leadership in the forms of developing a transition. Initially, the Sudanese ruling military council said it would take 2 years to transition to a civilian government. The civilian portion, the protest portion, is looking to really speed that along. From my understanding, some kind of preliminary transitional government agreement between the two sides has been met. I have no ideas to the details of it, if it's actually reflective of what the protesters want as a people versus maybe what the leadership of the protest movements could gain by making corrupt deals, or what the kind of police bullied them into accepting. Recent protests did break out in at least one set of clashes. 30 protesters injured by live fire. I didn't read about any of them dying, at least so far, so that's a good thing. One cop was killed. It's not clear to me if this was like a Sudanese government loyal to the ruling military council, or potentially maybe just a police officer on the sidelines, or I don't know how things work in Sudan well enough to say, but was also killed here. Protesters point the fingers at provocateurs that weren't reflective of the protest movement and were, trying to undermine it by carrying out this violence. In Burkina Faso, ethnic violence in that country continues. This time it's the Islamic State affiliate in that country taking responsibility for killing 6 Christians at a church. Apparently this church was surrounded by, I think, 20 gunmen. Again, 6 people were just gunned down, civilians, and then the church was burned, and, terrible, horrible thing there. This is increasingly a problem in this region of Africa, where you have jihadist affiliate groups that have had, kind of embedded themselves with different kind of movements in these countries and are now carrying out these ethnic style attacks. Some of this, of course, is blowback that we could trace to Libya and the U.S. policy and war there of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, arming and supporting with, NATO air power, including the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was led by some pretty jihadist elements, and then once they're done in Libya, they go to sow chaos around the rest of Africa here. But another consequence of that war, of course, is a migration crisis that happens as tens of thousands of people at least have drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea from Africa into Europe in the days since Gaddafi fell. That continues to happen, although at a much slower rate. 65 people recently drowned when a boat capsized after leaving Libya and then off the coast of, I believe, Tunisia. Algeria is another country that has suffered from blowback from kind of the Libyan war and the jihadist elements spreading out and sowing chaos. However, the people there in that country have been protesting and demanding a better government. This resulted in the longtime leader of, I believe, 20 years stepping down, and the people continue to protest, demanding a civilian liberal government, or I guess more liberal, I don't know how liberal government there. And Eric Margolyes has expressed some optimism about that protest movement, so hopefully we could see maybe a better state there in the outcome of this protest movement. AFRICOM reported that they killed 13 ISIS fighters in Somalia. It's, again, as I've said on the show several times now, hard to say what actually happens when these AFRICOM bombs fall. There's very little journalism that comes out, and then, we've seen time and time again that the government only admits to doing in Africa what they have to. Most of it is done in the, most of it possible without announcing. If they happen to kill, or, at least I'm guessing are pretty sure they killed militants, they make these announcements saying that, oh, we actually killed some bad guys this time, but who knows how many civilians are dying in these strikes or how many of these people are miscounted. Also, when you look at Somalia and realize that even if the U.S. airstrikes are actually killing some bad actors, whether they be Al-Shabaab or ISIS, there doesn't seem to be any progress in the fight against these groups whatsoever. Al-Shabaab still holds a large area of the country. ISIS, the affiliate in that country, according to the Pentagon, was only supposed to have about 80 fighters, but they continue to kill a few dozen every couple of months. So the numbers there really don't add up unless it turns out the U.S. airstrikes are just creating more fighters. The ISIS affiliate in Nigeria claims to kill 11 soldiers in the northeast region of that country. Here it seems that ISIS is taking ownership, I guess, of some of the territory or some of the violence once committed by Boko Haram. And last, South Africa, there was elections in that country, parliamentary. The African National Congress won those elections. That party is currently headed by the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. All right, some news on the U.S.-Iran tensions. A UK general, and I think a UK general that was involved in the coalition mission against ISIS, said there's been no, increase in threat from Iran since, the Pentagon has claimed. So he's basically saying that, there's certain threats presented because of the hostile nature of the U.S.-Iran relationship that's a baseline anyways. I guess it's possible that one of these militias backed by Iran could turn on U.S. or coalition forces, or Iran has military assets in the Persian Gulf or in Syria that could potentially, attack coalition forces, but nothing has changed recently to make that seem like the case. Now, I understand that the U.S. and the UK governments are pretty much all coming out against this guy, saying that's not true. I think it's a great thing that we had this UK general come out and make this statement, because when you look at like what's going on right now in Yemen, it's so easy, I think, to see the potential for something to happen, get blamed on Iran, and then a small conflict breakout that could turn to something much bigger, much quicker. This is kind of the subject of a recent Patrick Cockburn article, which I'll link to in the show notes page. But an example I want to look at here of something that could be a small event that turns into something way too big would be like the Houthis carrying out drone attacks against Saudi oil fields. So you have a situation here where Saudi Arabia has been waging pretty much a genocidal war against the people of Yemen for the past 4 years and 2 months, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dead, and is just the worst kind of thing. And throughout this time, the Houthis really don't have an army or an air force to fight back. It's not like they're, regularly able to like fight on a battle line with Saudi Arabia and attempt to take or kill Saudi soldiers. Most of the forces used by the Saudi side of this war are, mercenaries either from Sudan or other areas of Africa that come to Yemen as migrants. There are a few Yemeni soldiers that have remained loyal to the Houthi government. But again, I think most of these soldiers end up being paid by Saudi Arabia anyways. And so I think to inflict damage on Saudi Arabia and attempt to fight back, the Houthis have carried out, strikes against Saudi Arabia, but these get blamed on Iran and kind of get painted in the terrorism like this is unfair warfare that the Houthis are waging. Now, of course, when I was, reading this and thinking about this leading up to the show, it kind of remembered this movie that I really liked as a kid called The Patriot. Of course, the Mel Gibson film, I'm sure almost everybody's seen it, where Mel Gibson is a swamp fox and he runs around, in the backwoods and, attacks redcoat shipments, in difficult terrain and just wages this kind of warfare that the British look down upon and think is uncivilized. The Americans should meet them in an open field and all line up across from each other and shoot. And so, in a sense, we've really turned into the kind of the stuffy redcoats here, where, they're not playing by the empire's rules. And so we're going to wave their finger at it. The only, I think, bigger risk here is, that could end up with the U.S. labeling the Houthis as an Iranian ally and then, really not having any legitimate targets to attack in Yemen. I mean, why are they going to bomb another school? They've been bombing the country for 4 years and, just haven't been able to move the Houthis off of their positions. So, maybe try to bomb Iran as a meaningful response to that action. So something dangerous like this, really could happen. And it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And also to remember that, when the Houthis or anybody in the Middle East acts out against Saudi Arabia or the UAE, there could be plenty of other reasons for it other than Iran was behind it and Iran is just this evil country that looks to sow chaos. All right, finish up here with the port of Hodeida and what's going on. I haven't been very optimistic about this story from the start, although things looked better because the UN statements were positive, I thought. But then I listened to this interview by, I'm going to probably butcher this guy's name, and I've talked about him on the show in the past, Hasham al-Omsmi. And he was a Yemeni who was living in Sana'a at the start of the war. I followed his Twitter account this whole time. At one point, he's imprisoned by the Houthis, but then he's freed. I believe he travels to the Western Europe area and apparently is now in Cairo and gave an interview to the BBC talking about what's actually happened here at Yemen. Is the Stockholm Accords went into effect about 6 months ago and were set to expire at the end of 6 months. The UN desperate to make anything happen because talks have been stalled out this whole time. Although, as I said last time on the show, I think there's been in the sense a little bit of a meaningful ceasefire in Hodeida. The fighting there has not been quite as intense as expected. So anyways, the news that the UN released about Hodeida was that the Houthis had taken the unilateral step of turning the ports over to the Yemeni Coast Guard, and this was portrayed as a victory. Now, what Hasham says is that, in fact, the Houthi Coast Guard the Yemeni Coast Guard is loyal to the Houthis, and so it's not something that the opposition agreed to, and that's why it was a unilateral step, not because that the Houthis just did something so kind and generous. This was the case the last time that the Houthis said they turned the ports over. It turned out, in fact, I think in that case that some of the members of the Yemeni Coast Guard that were then patrolling the ports were actually photographed and known members of the Houthis. All right, so I don't really love ending the show for the week on this kind of sad news that maybe the Hodeida peace talks weren't going as well as the UN was portraying. Unfortunately, sometimes the world's just a terrible place. And, the people of Yemen just continue to suffer while the U.S. empire allows it to happen for absolutely no reason. I don't know. Share the show, please. I just want to get the word out there about some of these things. Sometimes I think, hell, if people know, maybe they'll change their mind. So I'll go and do a podcast and talk about it. But what that means is that, you got to share it so other people hear it. libertarianinstitute.org to find the show online along with my daily news roundup. Check out immersionnews.com, Twitter at KYAAALE.